Good afternoon. I'm Professor Jenny Shaw, Executive Dean of the Faculty of Arts here at the University of Adelaide, and I'm delighted to welcome you here to Benithan Hall and on the Goodman Crescent lawns, watching the big screen broadcast outside, to this special public lecture towards universal education presented by former Prime Minister and visiting Honorary Professor at the University of Adelaide, Professor Gillard. I would like first to acknowledge the Kaurna people, the original custodians of the Adelaide Plains and the land on which the University of Adelaide's campuses here at North Terrace and at Waite, Theberton and Roseworthy are built. Before Professor Gillard speaks to us, I have great pleasure in introducing our Vice-Chancellor and President, Professor Warren Bebbington, to say a few words of welcome. Warren.
Thank you, Jenny, Deputy Chancellor Di Davison, distinguished guests, colleagues, students, ladies and gentlemen. The first time Julia addressed a crowd in this hall a year ago about her memoir, the place was packed, and we didn't think we'd top that. But today, not only is the hall packed, but we've had to stream it. We have seats outside and a giant screen on the Goodman lawns. It's quite an event. The interest is well-founded because all of those of you who've heard Julia Gillard speak know what an outstanding speaker she is. Since being appointed a visiting professor here in 2013, she's now lectured in the arts faculty to nearly 1,500 students in areas such as foreign policy, Australian politics, social science. She's worked with student interns. She supported the university as a distinguished member of our alumni community, and all the students who've worked with her found her classes highly engaging, enlightening, inspirational. So we're tremendously appreciative, Julia, of all you've done as an honorary professor. The university has a long history of being involved with political leaders from all sides of politics. Julia is one of three who hold honorary positions in our politics program here. Our alumni include the Premier, Jay Weatherill, the Foreign Minister, Julia Bishop, the Education Minister, Christopher Pyne, as well as former political leaders Natasha Stott-Despoja, Alexander Downer, former Premier John Bannon. So I think we've punched above our weight in our influence on Australian political life in this university. Today, Professor Gillard will be telling you about her vision towards universal education. So thank you again for doing this, Julia, and thank you to all of us for your interest and for coming today.
And now just a few words about our speaker. Professor Julia Gillard served as the 27th Prime Minister of Australia for 3 years, from June 2010 to June 2013. As a child, she migrated with her family from Wales to South Australia and was educated just south of the city here in Mitcham and Unley, and then here at the University of Adelaide. After graduating with a Bachelor of Arts and Bachelor of Laws from the University of Melbourne, Julia specialised in industrial law before entering politics. She was the first woman to hold the position of leader of the Australian Labor Party, and Australia's first Deputy Prime Minister, and then Australia's first female Deputy Prime Minister and first female Prime Minister. Her achievements in public service range from reforming Australian education at every level, from early childhood to university education, creating an emissions trading scheme, improving the provision and sustainability of healthcare, aged care and dental care, commencing the nation's first ever national scheme to care for people with disabilities, and restructuring the telecommunications sector, as well as advancing a national broadband network. In foreign policy, Professor Gillard strengthened Australia's alliance with the United States and secured stronger architecture for the relationship with China, and upgraded Australia's ties with India, Japan, Indonesia and South Korea. In late 2013, she was appointed to a visiting honorary professorship here at the University of Adelaide, as our Vice-Chancellor mentioned, and in that role she has now taught a wide range of students in the Faculty of Arts, including several hundred first-year students this year enrolled in the faculty's core first-year course. Julia is also a non-resident Distinguished Fellow with the Centre for Universal Education at the Brookings Institute in Washington, and in February 2014 she was appointed Chair of the Global Partnership for Education, a leading organisation dedicated to expanding access and quality education worldwide. Earlier this year, Professor Gillard was appointed Chancellor of an Australian-based online education provider offering courses in business and management. In her spare time, and she does have some, I believe, she is also patron of the John Curtin Prime Ministerial Library in Perth and a member of the Board of Directors of Beyond Blue. Now, with such a distinguished and diverse biography and autobiography, as our Vice-Chancellor mentioned, it was one of the last times Julia was here, was one of the launches of her book. Julia is extremely well equipped to discuss one of her great passions with us today, that is universal education. So now please join me in welcoming Professor Gillard to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and in a spirit of reconciliation, paying my respects to elders past and present. I want to thank you for that very warm welcome. I'm absolutely delighted to be back here at the University of Adelaide today. It was at this university that I first raised my voice in support of a quality education for all. It was actually in this hall, as a somewhat terrified undergraduate, I was invited to address a graduation ceremony on precisely that topic, a quality education for all. Now, that was many years ago, indeed so many years ago, that I am going to not put us through the painstaking process of counting the years in between. But it is with a delightful sense of coming full circle that I now stand before you as an Honorary Professor in the School of History and Politics at this university, and I'm here to speak on exactly the same topic I talked about all those years ago, a quality education for all. Before getting to the substance of my remarks, can I acknowledge collectively the great and the good of the university, of course led by the Vice-Chancellor Warren. Thank you very much for the opportunity to join this community as an Honorary Professor. And thank you for letting me loose to speak to students. I absolutely love my time here on campus, and I particularly like the opportunity it gives me to speak with so many bright young students who pepper me with very clever and very hard questions. So this experience, although occasionally challenging for me, gives me a wonderful sense of confidence about the calibre of the next generation of Adelaide University graduates. So congratulations to you, Warren, and the team you lead for that. And when they graduate, they will join the alumni of the third oldest university in Australia, a place that commenced enrolling men as undergraduates in 1874, whilst fighting for the right to enrol women. That campaign for women's education was won by 1880, making this university the first in Australia with the power to admit women to degrees. Given this history, it seems appropriate to start this lecture on universal education by taking you back in time and sharing with you some fascinating research published this year by Rebecca Winthrop and Eileen McGivney, colleagues of mine at the Brookings Institution in Washington, where I am privileged to serve as a Distinguished Fellow. Their work tells us that 65 years before this university was established, in 1809, the number of children attending primary school globally was just around 2.3 million. Education was enjoyed by only a tiny fraction of the globe's population, which at that time was just around 1 billion people. But the number of school children was to grow rapidly during the 19th and 20th centuries, as throughout the world nations embraced compulsory schooling. In 1875, a year after this university opened its doors, South Australia made going to school compulsory for all. The movement for education for the masses was by this stage sweeping Europe, having started in Prussia as long ago as 1763. As the rich but bloody history of the 20th century unfolded, Throughout the world, more schools were built and more children were educated. The impetus for this change varied. Nationalism certainly played its part, and particularly in the post-World War II era, newly independent countries built a sense of community and citizenship through schooling. The changing nature of the global economy both drove and was driven by the rise of mass education. The Industrial Revolution and the technological advances that followed it required workers of higher and higher skill levels. Literacy and numeracy needed to be attained by the many, not the privileged few. Be they democracies or dictatorships, prosperous or poor, nations around the world increasingly embraced education for children. The idea that education was a right for all children, irrespective of gender, race or caste, evolved over time. As the world emerged from the ruins of World War II, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights articulated a sense of rights and duties for all people, including the right to an education that was to be free and compulsory at the elementary level and directed to the full development of a human personality. That progressive ethos carried through into this century. The Millennium Development Goals, struck in the year 2000, declared attaining universal access to primary school as one of the 8 aims of the world to be fulfilled by the end of this year, 2015. In doing so, the MDGs echoed the Education for All approach globally, agreed in 1990. What all of this has meant is that over the last 200 years, the number of children attending primary school globally has grown from the modest start of 2.3 million to 700 million today, covering nearly 90% of the world's school-aged children. Such progress should never go unremarked and is truly worthy of celebration. Indeed, there is plenty of evidence that in just the last 15 years, the Millennium Development Goal for Education has galvanised this landmark effort, with the number of children of primary and lower secondary age not enrolled in school dropping by 39%. But as our eyes turn from the past to the present, what becomes clear is that even with so much progress, there is still an enormous amount to do to enable every child to learn and reach their full potential. Across the globe, around 121 million children of primary and lower secondary age are not in school. 58 million are missing out on primary school, including 31 million girls. It is estimated that 250 million children access some schooling, but it is of such poor quality that they never attain even the most basic benchmarks in literacy and numeracy. As the head of the World Bank, Jim Kim, remarked at the World Education Forum in Korea earlier this year, if these children all inhabited one country, it would be the 5th biggest nation on earth. Looking to the future, there is painful news to absorb on how long it will take to equalise education gaps between the developed and the developing world. On quality, education writer Lance Pritchard estimates it will take at least 100 years, if not more, for children studying in developing country schools to reach the same learning outcomes as those attained today by students in developed country schools like our own schools. The UNESCO Education for All Global Monitoring Report estimates that at current rates of change, it won't be until 2111 that all children in sub-Saharan Africa will complete lower secondary education. Unsurprisingly, it will be the girls who get there last, with the poorest girls getting there a full 70 years after the richest boys. To put all of this on a human scale, consider this. My great-niece Isla was born a few weeks ago, and yes, she's beautiful. If Isla has children at the average age at which Australian women give birth, and in turn they have children at the same age, then Isla's great-grandchild will be born when the world is educating the first cohort of sub-Saharan African girls to universally go to lower secondary school. My great-niece's great-grandchild. These startling statistics all add up to one dramatic conclusion. Business as usual, the known and predictable rate of change is nowhere near good enough. It means we fail the world's children, particularly the poorest girls. In doing so, we violate their human rights and we deny our world its best possible future because educating girls is so transformative. Girls' education is vital not only for their own empowerment, but for the broader well-being of their families and nations. For instance, if all women in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia had reached secondary school, child marriages and early births would drop by almost 2/3. In South Asia, 22 million fewer children would be malnourished if their mothers reached a secondary education. And if all women in all poor countries had the opportunity of a secondary education, we would see child deaths cut by a staggering 3 million lives. Even if none of these things were true, it would be morally just and right to educate girls. But given these are the facts, it is obvious that the world's economic strength and well-being is maximised by educating girls. Girls' education can also be looked at through a security lens. There is a reason that terrorists, whether it be the so-called Islamic State or Boko Haram, violently target the education of girls. Women's empowerment is the antithesis of their brutal ideology of subjugation and sexual slavery. So, before us, we have a cause and a challenge, one that is enormous in scope. But there is some good news. Many are already mobilised and making a difference to girls' education, including the Global Partnership for Education, which I am privileged to serve as Chair of the Board of Directors. GPE is the only multilateral organisation solely dedicated to school education. Our partnership includes donor governments as well as 60 developing countries, civil society, private philanthropy, the private sector, all of us in one partnership together. GPE is dedicated to the patient work of strengthening education systems in a country-led development model. It is a genuine partnership that works at a country level and globally to enable schooling to be properly planned and appropriately funded. GPE's efforts are directed to the poorest nations on earth, and fully half of our work currently is in fragile and conflict-affected countries. In Benin, where the primary school completion rate for girls is 57%, compared with 72% for boys, GPE's previous and current grant supports the country's education sector plan and focuses on improving access and equity for girls. In that nation, we are providing school meals prepared by a network of mothers, and that has proven effective in getting more girls to enrol and stay in school. Today, more than 120,000 children are benefiting from that school meals program. More than 90,000 primary school girls from deprived districts also receive school supplies each year to lessen the burden of school expenses for their families and to prevent early dropouts. GPE is also present in South Sudan, which has the worst indicator for girls' education in the world, with only 7 girls for every 10 boys in primary school and 5 girls for every 10 boys in secondary school. In fact, horrendously, in South Sudan, women and girls are more likely to die at childbirth than to complete a primary school education. To contribute to changing this shocking reality, GPE is providing a US $33 million grant to directly reach about 10,000 students with activities that have a strong focus on girls' education. Our support includes assistance towards the construction of 25 new schools in the neediest areas of the country, with separate sanitation facilities for girls. These are just a couple of examples of the work GPE is doing to make a real and tangible impact on girls' lives. We are restless to do more, to always aim to do better with every dollar and to advocate for more global ambition and resources. Our efforts and the efforts of others who work for global education are and will continue to make a real difference. But the need to bust beyond business as usual, to slash those 100-year timelines to less than 2 decades, still haunts me, and it should press on all of us. After all, in just a few weeks' time, the world's political leaders at the United Nations are expected to pledge that by the end of 2030, there will be inclusive and equitable quality education and lifelong learning opportunities for all. This promise, as ambitious and significant as it is, will just be words on a piece of paper unless the world truly steps up to meet it. Education globally needs more resources, more research and more innovation. At GPE's pledging conference last June, we raised $2.1 billion from donors, and in turn this was used to leverage developing country partners to increase their education budgets by a collective $26 billion US. Separately, the Clinton Global Initiative in Brookings, in a campaign I have been privileged to lead with Hillary Clinton, has catalysed US $800 million of commitments over the next 6 years for girls' education. This initiative, called Girls Charge, what else would you call it, is focused on improving learning and leadership opportunities for young women and girls. All this, together with the bilateral commitments of donor nations and other sources of private philanthropy, adds up to a lot of money, but it's not enough money. According to UNESCO, the global community needs to stump up at least $39 billion more annually to provide what is needed to educate the world's children. Make no mistake, this figure is what is needed from donors of external financing and has been struck, already assuming that domestic governments of developing countries escalate their own expenditure on education. In the face of this evidence of mammoth underfinancing, it is truly tragic to see that donor nations' aid to education has dropped by almost 10% since 2010, or 7 times the rate of decline of overall global development aid. For traditional donors, finding the political will to reverse this trend and bridge this huge resource gap will test us all, but it must be done. It is also vital for the global education community to identify new sources of funds. In that regard, it's very pleasing to see that the Government of Norway is politically and financially supporting the creation of a new global commission on the financing of education. This body, which will report in around a year's time, will hopefully make real progress in devising and implementing a strategy to bring new donor nations to education, as well as driving a deeper engagement with the private sector and private philanthropy. Part of the Commission's work will need to be designing innovative financing solutions that work at scale, as well as considering how to join together efforts within developing countries to create functioning taxation systems with the work being done used to properly fund education. The current lack of resources is compounded by a lack of research, and in an audience like this, when I speak of research, you are all so familiar. Donors understandably look for the best use of their money to ensure it is directed to what works. In turn, evidence of what works turbocharges the effectiveness of advocacy. Part of what has held the cause of global education back is the fragmentation and paucity of information about effective strategies for schooling and learning. One of the things that has helped build the global movements to vaccinate children and combat diseases like AIDS, TB and malaria has been the clarity of the evidence about what works, what it costs, and what gets saved both in lives and money as a result of action. Of course, education is different. A vaccine is a global good with a precise effect. In contrast, education is a locally delivered service which must be sensitive to culture and context. Learning happens over years. Measuring outcomes and improving quality are the subject of hot debates in our own nation. I know that only too well from my work in developing the transparency about needs and results which the website My School gives. Understandably, such debates don't just magically disappear in developing country contexts. But even understanding these differences between the two sectors, there is much that can and should be done to improve evidence, identify best practice, and develop new thinking in education, including the education of girls. A personal priority of mine is thinking through what can be done to create global platforms for the provision of educational inputs like books, technology, teacher professional support materials and assessment mechanisms, so that we can bring the efficiencies that come with scale as a support to country-led education planning and implementation. There is much work to do, but my own life experience here in Australia convinces me huge reforms are possible and that such change is vital. Here in Australia, we know how important it is to educate girls. Our girls have more educational opportunities than ever before and they are excelling because of it. The majority of university students today are women, and 42% of women aged 25 to 29 hold a university degree compared to 31% of men. What a spectacular achievement this is. Australian girls start their lives with equal access to learning and all the opportunities that brings. Education and gender equity are inextricably linked. If girls have equal opportunities early, their chances of forging equal futures are much improved. Looking abroad, we need to do more for girls globally who are stuck on a very different starting block. Removing gender barriers in education is the key enabling step towards a more equal world. We have achieved that in Australia. We must achieve it for all girls. Ensuring universal education is morally right. I believed that when I handed out leaflets on this campus as an undergraduate, and I believe it still. Ensuring universal education is the economically prudent thing to do. As Education Minister and Prime Minister, I was provided with countless briefings about the economic benefits of education. Educating girls is the ultimate retort to those who see women as inferior beings. If a young girl like Malala is brave enough to risk getting killed for an education, surely we can be big enough to ensure that education is there for all girls. I invite you to become an activist in this cause of our time. Persistent advocacy to governments that provide foreign aid matters, and I urge you all to raise your voice about the need to accelerate investment in education. This could be as simple as adding your voice to a chorus of tweets or signing a petition for change. It could include making a donation to amazing organisations working for change like CAMFED, the Campaign for Female Education. Here at the University of Adelaide, I learned a long time ago that positive change for education doesn't just happen. It comes about because people care, people campaign, people crash through. That's my message, or perhaps I should say as an honorary professor, that's my lesson to you today. Like everyone who has ever tried to teach, I hope my lesson stays with you. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Gillard. Now, what we'd like to do is Julia and I will take a seat, you can see in the middle here, and we're going to explore some of the rather sobering and challenging themes that Julia raised in her speech. So what I'll do first is ask Julia a few questions, and then we'll take a few more from the floor. We'll have roving mics for that part of this afternoon's event. I think mics are on, you can hear that? Look, there are a lot of things you raised there, and I think one of them is the obstacles that I think we face, especially for girls and young women in developing countries in attaining a genuine high-quality education seem insurmountable. So if there was one thing you could change, what would it be?
If there was only one thing I could change, it would be the volume of the resources. I mean, that's not the only thing that we should be changing, but the task is going to require more money, and I can point to enough programs that work around the world, things like the feeding program I spoke of, cash transfer payments to families that send their girls to school, and those things work because for very, very poor families, there's an economic choice to be made. Do you have your girl out in the fields labouring? Do you have her taking goods to market? Do you have her attending to domestic duties so an adult is freed up to do those things, or do you send her to school? It can be, the presence of a good meal every day that will tip a family over into saying, yes, the greater benefit for my family is my girl goes to school and she gets fed. Or a very small cash transfer payment can change the equation. Yes, it's in the interests of my family for my girl to go to school. And those incentives are particularly needed for girls because in the poorest of families, the boys will tend to be privileged and get the first access that the family can afford. So if I could change one thing, it would be the volume of resources available for effective programs like those around the world.
Now, moving closer to home, I think, as you pointed out, we've achieved a lot in this country in terms of girls and women's education, but I think we still fall far behind on the metrics for Australian Indigenous education. And I just wonder again what you would advise us that again, we here in this country can do for access to education, especially for Indigenous Australians here in this country, but perhaps also in the wider global context.
I think here in Australia we've got to remember how quickly in many ways things have changed for girls and girls' education. Not everything is as it should be, and I am concerned, as others are, about the statistics that show girls still disproportionately select out of science and mathematics subjects, the so-called STEM area of work, which is now so enabling for many of the occupations and capacities that people need today. So there are still some things to do. But gee, it's changed quickly. I mean, during my own lifetime, I went to a great school, I went to Unley High School, but by the time we were doing so-called electives, the girls were doing cooking, laundry and sewing, while the boys were doing metalwork, woodwork and electronics. I did a whole term of laundry during my high school education. So, I'm not 102, so these things have all changed quite quickly. For Indigenous education, there's been a far more intractable set of issues to deal with, but we shouldn't convince ourselves that there's been no change or that nothing works. There are things that work. I've been in Indigenous communities and seen things that work. What is necessary is, long-term backing in of those changes, not expecting in a fad kind of way that a new change should cycle through every 2 or 3 years, but the most effective of what can be done being done persistently for change.
I'm going to avoid any comment about laundry. It's going to stick.
You're going to ask me some advice.
No, we'll just stay right away from it, I think. But no, I think, as you mentioned, here in Adelaide, of course, we are very fortunate in the context of this country too. I think being the first university in Australia to admit women, the second in the world, in effect, to admit women, and also, of course, being the first state in Australia to give women the vote. And I just wonder how much of that tradition of gender equality do you think had an impact on you and your direction?
I think it was always sort of in my education and in my shaping how progressive South Australia had been about the inclusion of women in public life, about women voting, about women enrolling and getting degrees from this great university. So I think, you know, those things, even if they're not at the forefront of the mind of a young person, they create part of the backdrop against which your life is lived. And if that backdrop is one that emphasises gender equity and fairness, then that will have an implication for how you go about living your life and for the, you know, kind of confidence that you bring to those tasks. So I think it is important that as a state we've got that great history to point to.
Thank you. Now I think we might take a few questions from the floor. So there is a roving mic, a couple of roving mics. So I think we have staff, there are a couple of hands up down here, some up the back. Please wait till the mic gets to you so that everyone can hear your question. And look, so that we have time for a range of questions, please, if you can, keep your question very short and to the point and avoid, if you like, comment rather than question if possible. Thank you. So our first one, take one down the front here and then one up the back.
Okay. Hi, good afternoon. I'm Xiaowei Yang, a health science student here in the University of Adelaide. Thank you for bringing us such a brilliant speech. My question today is a universal problem that both Australia and China are facing together. So just like the rising education costs, the fastly increasing healthcare bills are threatening all nations, including Australia and China. Does this mean that the pharmaceutical companies are having less and less profits? Because of this, coupled with aggressive bargaining behaviors from the government, many pharmaceutical companies are having less profits and our employees are becoming redundant. So what would you define as a reasonable profit, a reasonable price, and a reasonable growth for a pharmaceutical company? Thank you.
Fortunately, I can duck all of those very hard questions because the system we've operated in Australia for a long period of time, and it is continuing still, the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme, which I think is a world-leading public policy, is one in which it is not politicians who are picking and choosing what medication should be made publicly available or subsidised to the community. That is being done by health experts who assess, you know, because there is always a pipeline of new medications coming on stream, who assess those medications for their effectiveness but also for their cost efficiency. You know, are they going to do something so much better than currently available pharmaceuticals that the extra cost is worthwhile? And they're very complicated statistical models and metrics that lie around all of that. And then when they've come to the conclusion that yes, it is, then there is a pricing authority that steps in and does the bargaining, and that can be based, you know, obviously it's highly correlated with volume. So, you know, I think that that's a good system. Ultimately, government has to tick, you know, when all of those recommendations come through, will those medicines or vaccines actually be funded? But I think that's the appropriate decision for government, not trying to pretend that they've got the health expertise. I mean, you know, none of the, you know, Prime Minister Abbott isn't, I wasn't, Prime Minister Rudd, and you can keep going back in time. No one would have held themselves out as a frontier health scientist. So it's good that we had those experts to work with us.
We'll take a question up the back with the microphone. Yep.
My name's Elijah. I'm a history, arts, politics, language student. My question's to do with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander learning. There's been research that shows that Aboriginal students tend to speak like 3, 4 or 5 of their own Indigenous languages. Is it a pushing idea that to actually teach them in Indigenous language in regards to the lands that they live on could be more beneficial than actually teaching them in English and then having English as a second language?
I think like a lot of bilingual education around the world, it ends up being a mix. I was recently back in Wales, where I was born before my parents and I and my sister migrated to Australia in 1966. And, you know, Wales has its own language, Welsh. My parents were of that generation that speaking Welsh was actively discouraged and the language was almost lost. And now the language has been revived, and part of the revival has been that children attend primary schools that some of them teach only in Welsh and teach English as a subject the way when I was in school we learned French as a subject. Some of them are bilingual, you know, so part of the teaching is done in English and part of the teaching is done in Welsh. By the time people are in secondary school, then obviously they are being schooled in English. And when you travel around Wales, you'll see people speaking Welsh to each other, you'll see them speaking English to each other, and everybody you want to speak to speaks English. So there's, you know, no difficulties with their integration into the economy of the UK and beyond into the world. So those models are well known. In our Indigenous schools, some of that kind of teaching does take place now. You know, a mix of own language and English. What obviously makes it so much more complicated for Indigenous Australia is that it's many languages, and so having teaching materials and publications at critical mass which can help with own language instruction is actually quite difficult because of the number of languages. But I think, you know, there's always the ability to put the teaching together in a way that nurtures own language as well as nurtures capacities in English.
Well, we've got time for one final question. I think we've had a hand up the back there for some time, so we might take that one there.
Thank you. Thanks, Julia. Surrounded by pictures of portraits of men on these walls, and probably from your experience in Parliament as well, it's a great first step getting girls into early childhood education. What can we be doing to help girls rise to leadership positions in education?
That's a very good question, and we don't want to, you know, look unkindly on the many male portraits around the room, and yes, you would see comparable ones in Parliament House. I think for our nation, there is a set of questions we've still got to ask ourselves about the journey of women beyond their years of education into adulthood, and the discriminations, many of them unconscious, some of them still structural, about things like balancing work and family life that hold women back. I recently had the opportunity to participate in a launch of some new research which was undertaken by the ANZ Bank, and that research showed somewhat startlingly that for Australian women, once they graduate, go and get their first job, that comparing their salaries to men who have graduated getting their first job, there's a 4% difference with the women coming out, obviously with the 4% less, given what we know about gender pay equity. Now, ask yourself, what on earth explains that? Men and women coming out of the same universities with the same qualifications, going for the same range of starting jobs, and the women are getting paid 4% less, showing you that there's still the workings of bias in the system, and those workings go all the way through to the leadership level. What do we need to do to nurture women leaders? Well, be conscious that there's a problem. Number one, acknowledge that if you believe, as I do, that women and men have equal merit, then if you're seeing anything, a parliament, a corporate board, whatever it may be, that doesn't have around half men and half women, then by definition you haven't got your most meritorious team out there doing the job. So acknowledge that, merit's equally distributed, we should therefore be looking for equal outcomes. Having acknowledged that, then start to look for what are the subtle and not so subtle discriminations that hold women back. Is it because access to a leadership position is based on time served in occupation and women lose that race because they take breaks for childbearing? Is it because the people who are selecting the next generation of leaders tend to be men and tend to look through their own networks, and there's a need to bust open those networks? Is it that women are lacking the confidence to put themselves forward at the same stage of career development as men? And there's plenty of evidence. In some of this is in publications like Sheryl Sandberg's book Lean In, that men will look at an advertisement for a job. You need to have these 10 capabilities, and if a man can do 3 of them, he'll put in a job application going, oh, I can do 3, I know something about 2, and I'll kind of learn the other 5 whilst I'm doing the job. Whereas women will look down those 10 capabilities, and if they can't do all 10 of them, they won't put an application in. So we need to be supporting women to have the confidence to go forward. And then I think there's some really interesting psychological things. There's some very good research now about the correlation between male leadership and likeability and the lack of correlation between female leadership and likeability. That is, in a blind trial, when men and women are divided into 2 groups and both are given a case study to read about a business person, exactly the same facts, except one group's reading it as if the business person was a woman and one group's reading it as if the business person was a man. And then at the end of that, they're asked, what do you think of this business person? Would you like to work with them? How likeable are they? Both the men and the women in the group that read about the female business person scores her less on all of those things than the group that scored the man. What explains that unconscious bias about, likeability and perceptions of women as leaders? So I think that there's some, really fascinating things to unpack here. And as a society, I think we're up to having that conversation. One of the things I'm really reassured about is that this debate about women and leadership is now everywhere, as it should be. When I finished as Prime Minister and gave my last speech, I said about my own Prime Ministership that gender didn't explain nothing, it didn't explain everything. It was for the nation to have a conversation about the shades of grey. Now, I've had plenty of days since then to regret the use of the terminology shades of grey. It wasn't clear to me what was going to happen with that terminology in the years in between. But I do actually think the nation is having a good conversation about the complications I pointed to, and that, I think, in and of itself will drive change.
Thanks, Julia. That brings our question and answer session to a close, and please join me in thanking Professor Gillard for her time.